Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Neil McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Public Relations and Communications for the Archdiocese of Toronto. We're really happy to have all of you with us tonight as we have an excellent webinar that we're going to be sharing with you and talking about persecution of Christians around the world. Certainly very topical, and even more so because this weekend we're going to be celebrating the World Day of Migrants and Refugees. It's the 106th annual World Day of Migrants and Refugees that the Vatican has identified each year, a day to bring attention to this important issue. And we're also going to be celebrating on Sunday at 10 a.m. in the Archdiocese of Toronto. We're going to be live streaming a Mass that is being celebrated by Cardinal Thomas Collins to commemorate the 106th annual World Day of Migrants and Refugees. So you'll be able to watch that on the Cathedral website, and we're going to share that link with you now, and we'll also follow up with you later after the webinar in case you'd like to join us, and we hope you will. It's a really important event, and I hope you'll be able to join us. So before we get started, I just want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping for those who may be joining one of our webinars for the first time. Your mics are muted, so if you're trying to speak to us right now, we can't hear you. We could have several hundred people on the webinar with us, so it's just not practical to have everybody with their mics on, but know that you should be able to see and hear the presenters. If for some reason you're having trouble with your audio, you can look at the control panel that should be probably on the right hand of your screen, and you can click on audio. And if your speakers on your computer for whatever reason aren't working, you can dial in on your phone, and you can listen in that way if there are problems with the audio. So we hope that you can see and hear us, and it's going to be an interesting evening. We're going to spend about an hour together and have some panel discussion going back and forth, and then we'll have some time hopefully for questions at the end. And if at any point you want to ask questions, again, in that questions pane in your control panel, you can type in your question there and send it to us, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of our presentation. So I am going to start things off with a brief prayer, and this is actually the prayer that is for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees in 2020. And we'll just focus ourselves and welcome all those who are joining us, whether you're from the Archdiocese of Toronto, somewhere across Canada. We know we have registrations from around the world too, so you're all most welcome. And let's root ourselves here in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, you entrusted to Saint Joseph what you held most precious, the child Jesus and his mother, in order to protect them from the dangers and threats of the wicked. Grant that we may experience his protection and help. May he who shared in the sufferings of those who flee from the hatred of the powerful console and protect all our brothers and sisters driven by war, poverty, and necessity to leave their homes and their lands to set out as refugees for safer places. Help them through the intercession of Saint Joseph to find the strength to persevere, give them comfort in sorrows and courage amid their trials. Grant to those who welcome them some of the tender love of this just and wise Father who loved Jesus as a true Son and sustained Mary at every step of the way. May he who earned his bread by the work of his hands watch over those who have seen everything in life taken away and obtain for them the dignity of a job and the serenity of a home. We ask this through Jesus Christ, your Son, whom Saint Joseph saved by fleeing to Egypt and trusting in the intercession of the Virgin Mary, whom he loved as a faithful husband in accordance with your will. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So at this time, again, want to welcome everyone who's just joining us. All are welcome here as we begin our webinar on Christian persecution around the world. We've got a great panel, and I want to take a moment to introduce each one of them. We'll start with Carl Haytu, who is the Canadian Director of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. Welcome, Carl. Great to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
We also want to say bonjour and welcome to Marie-Claude Lalonde, who is the National Director of Aid to the Church in Need. Welcome, Marie-Claude.
Good evening.
And finally, we have Deacon Rudy Ovchik, who's the Director of the Office for Refugees at the Archdiocese of Toronto. Hello, Deacon Rudy.
Hello, Neil. It's good to be here with you all.
So thank you. I'm going to jump right in. Let's start with you, Deacon Rudy. We talked about the Mass for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees. Maybe tell us a little bit about the Mass that you're organizing this weekend, and why it's important for us to be commemorating this occasion and to gather.
Sure. Well, every year on the last Sunday of September, the Church sets that day aside for us as Catholics to really reflect upon the suffering of this community that has not only been forced to flee from their homes, but oftentimes from their homelands. And so it's a day for us to reflect and think about refugees and migrants, but also to pray for the suffering community and to be especially attentive to them. So this Sunday, as you mentioned, the Cardinal has been gracious enough to celebrate a special Mass in honor of this event. So he'll be speaking about migrants and refugees. And as you noted, it will be live streamed. Following the Mass, we will be posting a recording of that Mass on our website, along with the Archdiocese and the Archdiocese of Toronto's website. We're also going to be placing on both websites pre-recorded video messages from a number of people, including the Honorable Marco Mendicino, Minister of Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, the Conservative Member of Parliament, Raquel Dancho, who's the Shadow Minister for Immigration. And then we're going to have two archbishops, the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Erbil, Iraq, His Grace Bashar Warda, who will speak to us about the suffering of the Christian community that the Christian community has endured in Iraq. And finally, we'll have a message from Archbishop Emeritus of Lahore, Pakistan, His Grace Lawrence Saldana. And he'll share with us the suffering facing the Christian community in Pakistan and those that have had to flee to places like Thailand and Malaysia.
Thank you, Deacon Rudy, and it's a wonderful opportunity. I participated in the Masses in the past, a little different this year, obviously, with the pandemic that we're doing this virtually, but also gives us the ability to use technology and bring in people like the Bishop from Iraq and others. So we hope that you'll tune in, or even you can view it after the fact, as Deacon Rudy said. So we'll talk about that again at the end of our evening together. Carl, I'm going to turn to you to kind of kick things off, to just maybe give us a bit of a brief overview of the situation that Christians in the Middle East are facing today. You're so deeply connected to that work and have been for decades. For those who may not be as familiar, can you give us a little snapshot of what's going on for Christians in the Middle East today?
Well, our agency has been involved in the Middle East since 1926, right after the Armenian genocide on the Christians at that time, which was a terrible period. But since then, I think we've never experienced such increased attack on Christians since the invasion of Iraq by the United States and Great Britain in 2003. At that time, if you recall, John Paul II had told President Bush, "You are opening a can of worms and you'll never be able to close it down." Well, 17 years later, it's still open. And the people that have suffered, and of course, the whole society of Iraq has gone through everything: civil war, attacks, the coming of Islamic State. And throughout that, the Christians have been always unprotected, always attacked. And just to make a reference, in 1 month, there's going to be a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the killing of the Syriac cathedral, where Al-Qaeda had come down and killed priests, children, babies, women, and men in this cathedral. And so this, I think, is representative of what's been happening, the martyrdom that the Christians have gone through in Iraq alone. And that's in Iraq alone. In 2003, there was about 1.5 million Christians in Iraq, a society that was vibrant, a society that contributed economically, socially, health-wise, at all levels, of making Iraq a great nation, and despite, of course, the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. But now, 17 years later, some people are talking now that there are less than 150,000 Christians left in Iraq. Some say even less than that. And so this is a tragedy in itself. We've never seen that since the Armenian genocide of 1915-17. It's unprecedented. And then what you have the Arab Spring, of course, an expression that the people especially young people, unemployed people, had enough of secular dictatorship in Syria, in Tunisia, and also in Egypt. And they took down their leaders. But in Syria, it went into a vicious civil war that is still not really over. What we saw happening there, this tragedy of war, it was the emergence of a Sunni-led, Sunni Muslim-led a group called the Islamic State that created total chaos in Syria and total chaos in Iraq from 2014. And so what we saw is the Iraqi Christians got a real beating from that, but also Christians in Syria got attacked as well. Victim of war, of course, as all Syrian have been victims. But if you look at the Christians, they really got it hard. 1 million Christians, and now they say 1.2, 1.3 million Christians has left Iraq in only nine years. It is another tragedy. And the Christians remaining are going back to their villages that are totally destroyed with nothing, with the level of starvation that is affecting them at this particular moment, particularly the children and the lack of school and everything else. And then you move to Egypt. In Egypt, when you go over there, it's, you know, when the president was removed from power, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood took power. They had a plan. Their plan was to evacuate, eliminate the Christian of Egypt. And when Morsi, the president, was removed by the military coup, a month later, pre-planned, premeditated attacks on over 500 properties of Christians, churches, schools, buses, businesses, restaurants were simultaneously attacked. That was pre-planned. And so since then, even though General Sisi took over and has vowed to protect Christians, and he has done so, it's been very difficult. Myself, I was in Egypt and experienced the fear that the locals are experiencing. We were visiting a small village in Upper Egypt where the visit was stopped rather abruptly. Why? Because there was a bunch of mobs waiting for us 2 blocks away with sticks and knives. And so we had to leave. And this is the constant fear that the Christians of Egypt live. Even though their relation with the Muslims in general is very good, you have this rise of fundamental Islam that has taken root in groups like Al-Qaeda, then Daesh, Islamic State, and a bit all over the Middle East. And then you have Israel-Palestine. The constant illegal occupation of the land of Palestine against international law forces the Christians to live in a very difficult situation. And many of them, after a time of not being able to just grow in this restrictive society, have decided to leave. But a new phenomenon is affecting the Palestinian Christians, is the rise of radical Islam as well. And that has not helped the Palestinian Christians, particularly to Gaza, where half of the Christians of Gaza have left in the last 10 years. And so the only country that is stable right now is Jordan. But let me tell you, if the king and his regime falls, the Christians are ready. I've talked to many Christians each time I've gone to Jordan, and many of them are ready to leave, and they'll be the first one to go. They're not going to wait to be slaughtered. They're going to go because they've seen what's been happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, and they're ready to go. I'm telling you that. And so looking through all those places, of course, you have a massive displacements of all those population, millions of peoples, and them, a lot of Iraqi Christians, a lot of Syrian Christians that are refugees in Jordan, refugees in Lebanon. And let me tell you, I've met so many testimonies, all the same story of terror they've gone through. They'll never go back to Iraq nor Syria. And they're just waiting for a ticket to come to Canada, Australia, Europe, or the United States. That's the sad reality. And our agency, of course, has been accompanying those people throughout that really rough period, but really it's a tragedy. And now there's Lebanon, but we'll keep that for a bit later as we talk a lot about Lebanon, where Lebanon, there's no persecution there, but the social and political chaos of Lebanon is affecting deeply the demographic balance of Lebanon, where many Christians might leave in the coming months and years if things don't improve in there. So that's it in a
No,
nutshell, Neil.
no, thank you, Carl. I mean, there's a lot of passion there, and you've been over in those parts of the world and can speak from firsthand experience. And so, I mean, when you think a million Christians gone in 9 years, I mean, we start thinking about those numbers. You think of, you know, cities in Canada that are, you know, a million five, and as if those people were no longer there. I can't imagine, and especially too with the media, we don't necessarily see those stories highlighted in certainly the secular media in Canada and in the West. So thank you for that overview. Mary Claude, I want to move to you. Are there other areas around the world where Christians are particularly oppressed that maybe people aren't as aware of, or that we should be knowing about or learning about?
Sure. Unfortunately, I have to say yes. And many countries do not respect religious freedom, religious rights of their population. And it's true all over the world. If I give you roughly statistics, you have 327 million suffering from persecution around the world, and you add another 178 million suffering from discrimination. So it's easy to see how this is common, unfortunately. And I subscribe to what Carl was saying. I've been there too, and it is awful. The situation of Christian in the Middle East, but elsewhere. An example I can give you is Asia. Asia, we talk about China. We think everything is good in China. We see the economic growth and people are being better off. But in terms of human rights and of religious freedom, it's terrible. The situation over there is even critical in certain areas. And you see the same thing in many countries in Africa. You think about Nigeria, and now we have Burkina Faso, where we're a bit worried. Of course, you have Egypt, Sudan. Many countries are affected throughout Africa. And now we see some kind of a pattern in the Sahel region of Africa, that violence is growing in general, but then violence against Christians is also something that's becoming more and more common over there. And unfortunately, you don't see that in the media, or very, very little. When we talk about China, it's always good thing, or the quarrels between Donald Trump and the regime over there. You don't hear about all the violations of human rights that there are. And if people are curious, just go in the Human Declaration of Human Rights and you'll see that religious freedom is there, and it's also with freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. And if you don't have freedom of religion, you certainly don't have freedom of conscience and freedom of thought. So this, you cannot say this is less important than the other. They're all very, very important. And we have to be aware that that's what's going on. And I'm particularly worried now with India and Pakistan also. In India, they had rough times. It was better for a few years, but now we see an increase in violent acts. And Pakistan, that's probably the country where we hear the most of what's going on over there. And you have, I mean, you regularly have people who are in prison accused of blasphemy, accused of forced conversions and things like that. And it has become a mean to settle quarrels with your neighbors. You accuse them of something like that, which is something very difficult to prove, or to say, no, I did not commit it. But it's becoming common, and it's a lot of sufferings. And those laws are difficult for any minority, not just Christian minorities, but for any minorities, and everybody's suffering from it. So it's not just a question of Christians, it's a question of human rights and of everybody who should be entitled to be free of practicing their religion.
No, thank you, Marie Claude. And that's, yeah, you just think of the reality for so many people that we are so many of us are oblivious to. You know, in a place like Canada, we tend to enjoy religious freedom. We can argue about, you know, if that is fully free. In some cases, you may say, well, we don't have the same freedoms in that sense, but we don't have a situation in Canada where we're literally being prosecuted or tortured or executed for our beliefs. And that's what's happening in so many parts of the world. And as you've talked about, it's not just a Middle East issue. We're seeing it creep up more and more in different parts of the world in almost every continent. And that's a wake-up call. It should be a wake-up call for us to, one, appreciate what we have in Canada. When we, you know, think in the Archdiocese of Toronto, we have 4 or 5 masses at our parish that we can go to without, you know, worrying about any violence against us in that regard. And that's just not the same for people in parts of the world where they literally going outside and talking about the fact that they're Christian could lead to death or torture. So thank you for sharing that. Deacon Rudy, maybe you could, you've traveled as well throughout the world and working on the refugee sponsorship program that's been so prevalent in the Archdiocese of Toronto. You know, why do you think the Christians are being persecuted in so many different parts of the world? Is it is there an overriding theme that you're seeing there, or what have you seen in your travels?
Well, there's a lot of various reasons why kind of drivers of persecution of Christians. And when I was thinking about and preparing for this webinar, you know, the book of Ecclesiastes, I remembered one of the verses from that. It said, "There is nothing new under the sun." There's nothing new. The suffering, persecution, violence that Christians are enduring today in many parts of the world is the same experience that Christians have faced throughout the millennia. Although in our day, it is occurring at unprecedented levels never before seen. The magnitude of it is staggering. 75% of the world's population live in countries where religious freedoms are threatened or non-existent. 75% of those who within those countries who face the brunt of religious persecution are Christian. So the magnitude of this issue is absolutely staggering. When as I was reflecting theologically, I remembered the words of the Lord in John's Gospel, and he said, "They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, a time is coming when anyone who kills you will think that he is offering a service, rendering a service to God." And I think that's what, you know, when I heard Carl speak about what has taken place in the Middle East, we are seeing those following kind of that extremist view of Islam, where it is allowed to flourish, have killed Christians thinking that they are rendering a service to God, which is terrible. But, you know, in my most recent travels, we traveled to Bangkok, Thailand, and there are about 1,500 Pakistani Christians that have fled there because, as Marie-Claude has rightly indicated, the abuse of the blasphemy law, which has really been, as Marie-Claude has said, has been used to resolve personal political disputes. Many of the families that we met with, and we met with about 68 of these families, fled there because as a result of the burning down of Joseph Colony, which took place in 2013. And the story that I heard from many of the refugees was that there were 2 Muslim men that wandered into Joseph Colony, a Christian community, and they were causing a ruckus. And there was a fellow, Salwan Masi, that came out and basically told them to quiet down. He's got sisters and children in the house, and they took offense at that. How can an unclean infidel speak to us in that way? And so they accused him of blasphemy. The following day, they stirred up that charge with the imams, and a crowd of about 7,000 came the following day and razed Joseph Colony to the ground. About somewhere between 125 to 200 homes were looted and burnt to the ground. And they tried to find Salwan Masi, and when they couldn't find him, they looked at anybody that was close to him. And we met with one individual, Sunny, who was a co-worker with Salwan. They were sanitation workers. Many of the Christians in Pakistan, they are of the lowest caste. Sanitation work is seen as beneath the dignity of Muslims, and so it's a job that is given to the Christians. They're very poor, desperately poor, and uneducated. Well, they tried chasing down Sunny. He fled, and they went from place to place to place, trying to stay one step ahead of the Islamists, and eventually fled to Thailand, where they heard that the UNHCR had an office there, and were hoping that the UN would be there to help. And sadly, many of the Christian cases that refugees that went and sought protection from the UN were refused. And so these families are living in very desperate situations. The Thai government does not protect them, does not see them as refugees or asylum seekers. They see them as illegal immigrants. And so they routinely round them up in immigration raids and place them in grossly overcrowded detention centers, where they languish until they either choose to return to their country of origin, where they face likely death, or they are resettled to places like Australia or Canada or the United States. Thankfully, through the generosity of parishes and dioceses throughout the country, we've been able to sponsor probably about 25 of these families. So desperate situation for the Pakistani Christians.
Oh, thank you, Deacon Rudy. And I mean, every one of those families, every one of those individuals has a story. And I mean, I know at the Archdiocese of Toronto, we sponsored a family with Cardinal Collins a few years ago, and you know, part of the challenge is identifying these people in those countries. I know from the work that Deacon Rudy does, because if they are identified as Christian, they're in danger, and so to work through that process of being even eligible to leave the country and make their way to a new homeland, so to speak, is a real challenge. So no, thank you for shedding some light on that. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. Carl, I want to go back to you. You know, there's going to be people who are asked about this, and conversations with family and friends, and maybe people who are skeptical of what we're saying. And so we want to give some questions to the panel to say, if we're asked about this in everyday conversation with friends or colleagues, how do we respond? How would you, Carl, respond to someone who says, you know, well, Christians are the largest and most powerful religion in the world, so there's no way they can be persecuted? I mean, we certainly in the West, we say, well, there's Christians everywhere. It doesn't look like there's persecution. How do you respond to people who may give you that argument?
Yeah, well, it has nothing to do with numbers, that they are larger number. I think Marie-Claude touched on it earlier. It's about right of citizenship, of equal right in a country. If there's no equal right and you're second-class citizen, and everything is geared in the education system, in the habits of a society, to see somebody that's different than you and smaller in number as a problematic issue, then of course there's going to be discrimination. That's what's going on. And so wherever there's a majority of Christians, we don't see as much of that happening. There is actually respect. Christianity brings respect. It brings this respect of dignity of all. Actually, Christianity brings services to all. I mean, this is the strength of Christianity worldwide, is to be of service. We see it with Pope Francis. That is the really strength and focus of his papacy, that we go back to the source of what Jesus was doing, to go and be present, to accompany and be of service to the marginalized. And that's what Christians are doing. They're doing it out of love. They're doing it out of compassion, out of friendship, and they're being slaughtered for it by radical people that want to keep the power because they're afraid. And so in those small countries, bigger countries where we see small numbers of Christians that are indigenous of those lands, like in India, for example, or in Eritrea or other parts, those people are born there. Their ancestors were born there, but because they are Christians, they're being targeted. And I think that's the problematic that we see. So it's about really accepting, there's a human right declaration that the UN voted on in 1948, that pretty much all the nations in the UN has adopted and voted in favor for, but it's not being reinforced at all. And so that's a major problem that we're going through. So it's more about establishing the right of all citizens to have equal right wherever they are. And that's the issue that we need to fight.
Oh, thank you for that, Carl. Going to you, Mary Claude. How would you respond to someone who may say, and again, this is someone that may be trying to, suggest that maybe it's not as big a problem as we're saying it is. Religion isn't a big deal. We're a more secular society right now, and if people would just stop being Christian and be as active in their faith, and this problem would go away. There are people that would say something like that. How would you respond to them?
Well, the problem will definitely not go away. It's not as easy as that. Sometimes not being Christian means automatically that you have to be Muslim. In some countries, you need to have a religion. Life is not taught in a secular way as we would see. And for many Christian, yeah, you could think that becoming a Muslim will make their life less miserable. But in fact, it can make their life more miserable because they will be targeted because they are newly convert. Women especially will be in dangerous positions if they change religion, or the government will go after these people if they change religion. So it's not that easy, and especially for women. I want to say that women now are not only persecuted, they're targeted for being Christians and women. And more we see rape becoming an issue, becoming a way of assaulting on the Christian community as a whole. So it's difficult. And another thing that I would bring is definitely that in certain countries, certain ethnic groups adopted a particular religion. So even if they pretend they're not Christian anymore, just by the way they look, by their name, by where they come from, people will know that they are Christians from origin, they are Christians. So it really doesn't solve the problem. It just adds a layer to the difficult situation. And I would like to share just a little story that a few years ago, I visited India in Odisha or Orissa, a region where in 2007, Christians suffered a lot. There were mass killings, and it was very difficult. And then we go in a village, and I have the very tall and thin man sitting, and he's listening, and the bishop is explaining how difficult it is for him to baptize people. Because I'm putting them in danger, I'm putting myself in danger, my family, for doing that, but we also have wonderful stories. And he's telling me, that man there that you see, he used to be Hindu. He participated in the riots and the attacks in 2007 and decided to become Catholic. And I said, may I ask a question? I would like to know why he became Catholic. I mean, he was part of the most powerful group, and now he's becoming Catholic. And the man simply answered, I saw them live. I saw that they were not seeking revenge. And when you hear things like that, why would they convert to any other religion? Why would they stop to be Christians? Christianity is beautiful, and it brings the best out of people, and even out of people you, in the beginning, you couldn't tell. So that man was an example of how it is important that Christians do stay where they are and that they stay faithful to their faith, even in difficult conditions.
Wow, that's powerful. And for so many of those people, if someone makes the argument, well, just park your religion, don't practice your religion anymore. They can't separate that. It's like oxygen for them. It's so much part of who they are. No, thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful. And Rudy, for people who may come to us with the argument and say, well, you know, the Canadian refugee system is very generous and it's easy to get into Canada, so there's no real problem here. I mean, you know the reality. How would you respond to an argument like that?
Well, first of all, I would recognize the great generosity of Canadians towards refugees. This last year, we led the world, Canada led the world in refugee sponsorship. What is very unique in the Canadian model is the manner in which regular citizens, regular Canadians leverage their time, talent, and treasure to sponsor refugees. So the whole private sponsorship of refugees program is so unique and in the world, and is heralded, it is the envy of many nations throughout the world. This past year, in 2019, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the private sponsorship of refugees program. And over the course of those 40 years, Canadians have sponsored and welcomed over 325,000 refugees, resettling them successfully to Canada. Like that is, if that doesn't speak of the generosity of Canadians, I'm not sure what will. But you know, it is not without challenges, right? So we think about the sheer number of refugees in the world. The latest UN numbers suggest that the refugee count in the world is 26 million. And so the work that we do as a nation, the work that we do as an office, is simply a drop in the bucket to the needs that are present in the world. Here in Canada, the demand for Canadians, so Canadians and permanent residents are able to sponsor their loved ones who are in need of refugee sponsorship. And the reality is that the demand here is far outstrips our ability to respond to it. Now, Immigration Canada, I think, prudently does a good job determining the level of immigration for Canada and sets aside a certain number for refugee resettlement. And each year, this office is given an allocation, which marks how many refugees we can actually submit an application for. And once we hit that number, we are unable to sponsor another refugee. So that's a great impediment for refugee resettlement in Canada. Just the relatively low numbers that we're allowed to sponsor in relation to the total number of demand out there from families and from the world at large. And the second impediment that makes it challenging is simply the cost of refugee resettlement. A sponsor is required to provide funds to support the refugee for a period of 1 year after they arrive to Canada and to journey with them during that 12-month period. And these amounts, which Immigration Canada determines, can be quite significant. And so that has proved to be a challenge for many of the sponsors who themselves are recent immigrants to Canada. And then lastly, the challenge is simply the processing times. Once an application is submitted to Immigration Canada, it takes on average 2 to 2.5 years for Immigration Canada to process that application. So, Canadians are generous, and we continue to do the hard work. I wish we were able to sponsor even more refugees than we are able to now.
Thanks, Deacon Rudy. Yeah, it's a long process, and as you say, I mean, so much has been done by the community. We're so grateful for everyone who's been engaged in the effort to sponsor, support the refugees coming to our country. And I mean, what's one of the joys of the Archdiocese of Toronto? We have Mass in 35 languages every week. It's one of the most diverse communities in the world. And so, we have communities for people from wherever they may be coming from in the world, and there's usually other people that they can get to know, friendship, and to connect with, which is really important. One thing I did mention earlier, I was talking about, that when we go to church in Canada, for the most part, we're not victims of violence ourselves. But I would point out, and someone I think on the question pane, and thank you for doing so, has pointed out we are seeing still some examples of religious violence, so to speak. We've had a number of statues desecrated in the Archdiocese of Toronto. We had one just today that was reported. I know the person who commented in the questions pane talked about one of our churches having a ceremony to kind of bless a statue that had been defaced previously. So we're seeing those kind of things that are cropping up more and more, which is really distressing. And so thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate the comment from the participant here. I recognize, just looking at our time, we're going to go about an hour, so we'll go to about 8-ish, 8:05. We're about 7:40, so I just want to move to a kind of bit of a call to action and ask each of the panelists, and Carl, maybe we'll start with you, if there's one thing that you would recommend that people who are participating in the webinar tonight could do to help persecuted Christians. What's something that we can do? We'll start with you.
Whoa, that's a big question. That requires, look, I think there's something that happened in our country that not too many people have been talking about, unfortunately. The world is changing, right? It's changing rapidly. There's an increased level of intolerance. There's an increased level of war and conflicts. There's a reorganization of the world affair. You have the environment issues, you have political systems falling, dictatorship being renewed and brought down, people on the move. We've never seen so many migrants in the world as today, migrants and refugees trying to seek out better world. And throughout all of that, there's an increased level of persecution. And just when the world acknowledges that, meaning the many European countries have Office for Religious Freedom, the United States has an Office of Religious Freedom. Canada had an Office of Religious Freedom. And the first thing that the current government, the Trudeau government did, the first thing they did when they came in power within a few months was to dismantle the Religious Freedom Office of Canada. That had done great work, not just for Christians, for Muslims, for Yazidis, and name all the groups. We were becoming a well-known and leader worldwide about recognizing that the problematic of persecution, of discrimination, of harassment, of lack of respect of basic laws were happening in front of our eyes. And so here we are, we had the best tool in front of us to do this, and it was dismantled. Now it's a one person hidden in an office somewhere that does her best, but it's not enough. The work that was done to raise awareness to our diplomats, for example, worldwide, to global affairs workers, the education they did. I was invited by them to give courses on what was going on, even doing the social teachings of the church to bureaucrats in Global Affairs Canada. I mean, those were very positive things that were taking place, and we were there with Sikhs, with Muslims, and others doing that as well. And so, here we are doing something exceptional, and it's gone. Just like that, wiped away from an ideological perspective, instead of facing the truth of what's going on. And so I think we really need to tell our MPs, to tell our current government that we need to have this office reestablished. We're not serious then as a country, as a nation. And it's true, we're welcoming a lot of refugees, a nice tap on the shoulder, but then we let many others being slaughtered because of their religion. It makes no sense. Those people deserve to stay in their home and live in equal rights. People don't decide just to leave because they want to leave. They want to stay in their home. That's where they're from. Nobody wants to come in Canada for the sake of coming to Canada, but their life is hell, so they're leaving. And so really that's what needs to be done. And of course, if you look at H Church in Need, look at Kenewa, we have programs on the ground. We do a lot of work to help the people. Like, Deacon Rudy was talking about all the thousands and millions of refugees that are waiting to leave. Well, somebody has to feed them, somebody has to protect them. And that's what we do with the local church that is present. Reach out a hand to all those people that are waiting in limbo to a better future. And so a donation to our organizations goes a long way, helping the local church to be better established, to do its work and what we do best. So I'd say that those are two particular points. Let's not hide away from being involved politically on issues like this. It's part of our faith to do so.
No, thanks, Carl. And I mean, that's part of the reason why we're having these webinars, right? To get people more educated, to get them more engaged so they can speak with some level of understanding on these issues. And there's a lot of people, and I know friends who are Catholic Christians who are just not aware of what's going on. And so hopefully sessions like tonight can spur people to action. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but good suggestions there, absolutely. Marie-Claude, how about any thoughts from your end, suggestions on what people might be able to do?
Well, you did talk a little bit about it. We're not informed. We have to stay informed, and we have to make an effort to be informed because this is not in the mainstream media. We have to dig a little bit, but if you start looking on the web, maybe with your morning coffee, you will rapidly realize that some people do talk about those things. So stay informed. Put pressure on the governments. I agree with Carl, that's important. Talk about it around you. You can work towards educating people around you. Just tell them you read an article about that in a newspaper or something. The more people know, the more they are aware, the more likely they will react, get engaged in doing something, and please don't forget to pray, because when I meet those persecuted Christians and I tell them, you know, we pray for you, surprise number one, they tell you, we do pray for you too. So it's really a communion there of prayer, but our prayers are their strength. It's what's helping them just go on with their everyday life, which is difficult, but without prayer, I think it would be impossible for them to go on. So we need to be there. Even from afar, we need to be there for them.
Prayer at the center, and that's, I mean, just perfect timing with the World Day of Migrants and Refugees Mass that's going on the weekend. Hopefully people participate in that, and then even with our families, we can say, let's take a look at the globe, let's take a look at the atlas, and look at different parts of the world, where you know, the roots of our faith, for example, in the Middle East or other parts of the world, and talk about the reality of what's going on there. We try to do that with our kids, and think of people who are there, and to look on a map, or, you know, look on the internet and see pictures, or learn and the stories. Aid to the Church in Need, Kenowa, the websites that you have some really great information for people to paint a picture of what it is really like for people, because sometimes you need that visual or that fuller understanding to really get connected. And once you do, then you start to really get passionate about that. So thank you for that, Marie-Claude. Deacon Rudy, how about you?
At the height of the Iraqi refugee crisis, we had 160 parishes out of 220 parishes across the Archdiocese raise their hand up when the Cardinal, when His Eminence said, will you help? And 160 parishes said, we want to sponsor a refugee. And I think our Christian faith, our Catholic faith, is a faith that has legs on it. It is a faith that takes action. And so I would encourage those on the webinar, get involved with your parish communities. Join a refugee committee if your parish does not have a refugee committee, has not sponsored a refugee family. Then, you know, have a discussion with your pastor and encourage him to, you know, take steps to be part of the solution with your help. William Wilberforce, I'll leave my comments with this quote from William Wilberforce, who was an MP in the British House of Commons. This was around the time of the slave trade in 1791. He said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know. So I think this webinar has done a wonderful job articulating the grave need for and the terrible plight of our suffering brothers and sisters throughout the world. And I think we need to now take steps to help.
Thank you, Deacon Rudy. Well put. Let's take some time for questions. We've had a number of that have come in here. I think this one would probably go to Carl, but if Carl, you want to pass it to someone else or somebody wants to jump in, feel free. The question is, what is being done to the stranded Christian refugees from Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and other parts of the world? Where are those in Jordan to go if the king and the government fails?
Well, the refugees right now, look, I was in Lebanon last year, met many Iraqi refugees in Beirut. A large segment of them, some have been there 5 years waiting. They're never going back, and they're not allowed really to work, but they work under the table, and they're being hired, whether they're from Iraq or Syria here, and you know, they're being hired by Lebanese businesses, and it becomes cheap labor at the expense of Lebanese worker who lost their job at full salary. And so it's kind of a rut that's been building in Lebanon, and so those refugees now have been hit by the blast. Their schools are down, dispensaries broken, food distribution gone. I mean, those people already live in the misery of Beirut, on the sub-level of the city of Beirut, cleaning and doing all the dirty jobs. And now they're without jobs. Now they have nothing. And so, of course, when you look at what's going on in Beirut and Lebanon, that welcome over 1.5 million refugees from Syria, Iraq, and let's count 500,000 still refugee Palestinians living there since the 1949 wars and 1967 war. You know, it's a heavy burden on a small country of 4.5 million people. So, you know, you can do as much as you can. As an agency, we have an office in Beirut, we have an office in Jordan, we have an office in Jerusalem, and those three offices welcome and work with the refugees. We work with the church that does very important work over there, because the local government are totally overburdened with the responsibility. And so, you know, you provide everything, schools for kids, psychological help, because when you're a refugee, the trauma level is very, very high. You know, you need to eat, you need to have a place to live, you need heat. If you go in the mountain of Lebanon, well, it can be -7 in the mountains. There's snow there. People live in tents. I mean, as refugees, I've seen it. So you need the heaters and things like. So, you know, it's basically to make the daily life of refugee the best possible. While maybe they might go back to Syria, Iraq, forget about it, or just find a way out. And some end up on boats in the Mediterranean Sea and end up dying on their way to Europe. So, you know, it's a rough life out there, and we're trying our best to accompany and help out all those people. But there's so much we can do, you know. And now in Lebanon, that's falling apart right now. It certainly won't help the refugees, as the Lebanese people themselves are totally crushed. So that's where things are at in terms of that.
It's a dire situation, right? Oh, thank you for that. Appreciate that, Carl. Deacon Rudy, maybe go to you. We actually have someone on the webinar from Jordan who is living there right now, and they're maybe you know, and if you don't, that's fine too. But they're saying that their refugee interview with the Canadian government has been indefinitely suspended because of COVID, and they want to know if anyone has an update on when those interviews might resume.
Immigration Canada has not announced any or provided any updates in terms of when their overseas visa offices will reopen. I think if I could guesstimate, I think when the vaccine is rolled out and the threat of COVID and transmission is limited, but again, I'm just speculating. Immigration Canada has not updated that for us. But what they have done is that they are opening the tap to allow refugees from overseas that already have their Canadian visa, that have already been approved for travel, and that have had their travel suspended because of COVID. They're now reopening that travel to Canada.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that, Deacon Rudy. I hope that's helpful for the participants. And Marie-Claude, we talk about COVID, and you know, how is COVID affecting persecution around the world. I mean, it's you talk about Rudy, and we were just saying about the things shutting down in terms of the pipeline. But are you hearing, because of the pandemic, is that having an impact on just persecution in general?
Yes, of course, it does have an impact on persecution. You just add one layer of misery on top of one layer of misery. And I've heard stories, for instance, in Asia, some Christians who went to get help because, of course, they lost their jobs too. Their kids out of school, they need food, so they go to a food bank, a local food bank, and well, they're Christians, so I'm sorry, we have nothing left. And they see other people getting packages, and so it's one more reason to discriminate. Unfortunately, these cases happen. And you also have the church who is serving the people, taking care of the people, but now they themselves don't have money. Masses being suspended, priests don't get money. Sisters who are teachers and get a little salary and run an orphanage with that salary, they no longer have a salary. So it's just adding to the current situation. And I'm sure many stories will come to us probably a little bit later, because communication is not always easy during COVID as well. We have to say that. But I'm sure we'll hear many stories of people who were affected because of COVID and because they were Christians too.
Oh, thank you. We think of our own realities of isolation. We can only imagine if you're in a situation where you're being persecuted, tortured, some people kidnapped in the midst of all this. It's quite something. Rudy, maybe can Rudy go back to you on a question on refugee sponsorship. The question is, why are there more Muslim refugees coming under the government-sponsored refugees than Christians? Why are the Christians getting refused after being interviewed when we know there are many out there?
Yeah, there was a Wall Street Journal article back in 2016. And this will set the stage for my response. The U.S. during that year, during the administration of President Obama, brought in 12,600 Syrian refugees to the U.S. And keep in mind, the Christian community in Syria prior to the war represented about roughly 10% of the Syrian population. And one would have expected at least 10% of the 12,600 Syrian refugees to be Christian. And arguably that percentage should have been much higher because ISIS was targeting Christians and other religious minorities. What in fact the reporters found out was that not even 1% of the 12,600 were Christian. It was less. It was about one half of 1% were Christian. And so something we have been advocating and pushing the government, because obviously this signals that something is broken with the selection process. The United States relied upon the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to select the refugees. And so something is fundamentally broken in that selection mechanism, and the Canadian government, through their government-assisted refugee program, too, relies upon the UNHCR to select the refugees. So I'm fearful that the same significant gross underrepresentation of Christians is occurring in our government-sponsored refugee program. And so this is something that I have had a conversation with the previous Minister of Immigration, and I will continue to advocate as much as I can with the current minister and to all who will listen. What I've been arguing for is the need for transparency, the need for justice, the need for equity, and that should include the Christians.
Oh, thank you, Rudy. And I know those conversations are happening, and Rudy's pushing hard on that, and we'll continue to do that. And I know someone had asked a question on the questions pane about petition. Petitions are there and they're good, but I can tell you my own experience in working with various government contacts, a personal letter, a phone call, or trying to set up a meeting with your local MP is far more influential than any petition that you can sign, because they see the petitions and they kind of say, yeah, well, anybody can sign a petition. If you take the time to write a personal letter, if you take the time to make a phone call, if you take the time to set up a meeting, and if you want to do that at some point, contact us at the Archdiocese or the Office for Refugees. We can help you. Kenawa, Aid to the Church in Need. We can help you in terms of messaging and things like that, because those MPs, they need to meet with their constituents. If you're a constituent, set up a meeting if you can. So don't underestimate the ability for each one of us to have a personal connection with our local elected official. Okay, we're just going to have a couple more minutes left. Marie-Claude, I wanted to ask you, there was a question about Ethiopia. What's happening in Ethiopia? I don't know if you wanted to take that one or if anybody wanted to jump in on that, if you're seeing or hearing anything about the situation there.
Well, maybe Carl knows a bit more about Ethiopia than I do, actually. So,
do you want to take that one, Carl?
Sure. Which direction do we want to go with Ethiopia? Do they say, or?
It just said, what about Ethiopia? So okay. It was very general.
What we see happening in Ethiopia, as you might know, it's a majority Christian country, massively Orthodox, so very traditional Orthodoxy. The Christians, Catholics there represent less than 1%. And an increased level of Muslim fundamentalists also popping out in the country, because they're right across Saudi Arabia, right, with the Red Sea. But that's not really the problematic. It's not an Islam Christian issue in Ethiopia. It's more a tribal issue. The same government has been in power since they got rid of the Marxist regime about 25 years ago. And that same regime has been used, tired with power, even though they've done some massive changes to bring the Oromo back in power. And the prime minister is of that tribe, one of the largest tribe, versus the Tigray, who had really defeated the Marxists at the time. They're trying to do this, but the tribal fighting is increasing. There are some radical faction that simply wants to take control of the country. And in one sense, this is bad news, because what we see happening is they are steering problematic. And a famous Oromo singer was killed not long ago, very famous, a young man, and he was just shot cold. And that has steered even more tension between tribes over there. And that compound on, of course, the situation of COVID that started pretty slow in Ethiopia, but now it's picking up. It's picking up fast all over the country, and they had to take serious measures. In a country like Ethiopia, what we see happening is you have a choice. You don't work, you die. It's not like we're in Canada where we have all those compensations that the government is doing. They can go in debt in order to create a cushion to help Canadians. That's not happening in Ethiopia. And this is one of the poorest country in Africa. And so when you have that going on, people then will say, the heck with washing my hands. I cannot even have water to just live. People live like in Addis Ababa. They live with one another. You walk in the streets. I mean, everybody walks beside somebody. There's no escaping it. So, the cases are increasing, and it's very scary. And people have tough decisions to make, and they have to work. The government might say no working, but they will work. Okay, they shut down all the schools. People did not go to schools, but now they will reopen the schools. And the country is very vast. Some areas, it's total droughts, like in the north, where in the Tigray region, where you have massive droughts for the last 8-9 years. People now are on the move in the south of the country because they can no longer live there. Then you have other parts of Ethiopia, there's too much rain. And it's flooding, massive flooding, and all that in the same country, compound with political problematic. And of course, you have some elements of Islam that could sneak in and take control of certain areas. We've seen it. Many villages are being confronted with that in a rural area, but it's still very short, very limited at this time. But this is a bit in a nutshell what's going on in Ethiopia.
Oh, thank you for that, Carl. Really appreciate it. I think this has been an education tonight. I know it has been for me, and I feel like I'm pretty informed and involved and engaged in some of these issues. And hopefully for those who've joined us on the webinar, you've learned a little something or a whole lot of something about the situation. I mean, these three panelists could go on for the next 3 hours, and you can see just by their answers and responses the wealth of experience and knowledge and passion they have for this issue. So we thank God that these people are working in this area. And I know that there was a comment about someone saying, I've never even heard of some of these groups who are involved in this work. Tell your friends, tell your family, share a web link, let people know that this is going on, because there's incredible work that's being done. And these aren't, you know, organizations with 100 employees here. They're small staffs. They're very efficiently run. They're doing amazing work. So as we wrap up this evening, and I apologize, we didn't get to all the questions. Maybe we'll have another encore session to talk some more, because there's a lot in here and a lot to chew on and digest after conversation this evening. But to recap a few things, talk to other people about what's going on, get informed, go to the Canada website, go to the Office for Refugees website, go to the Aid to the Church in Need website. They've got some really interesting information, so please do that. And I know if we don't share it on the screen tonight, we will share with you a little resource after the webinar, probably tomorrow, with a link to this webinar to share with others, but also their website addresses and other information. We also want to encourage you to watch the Mass for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees and the program that will follow the Mass. That's this Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. It will be live streamed on the St. Michael's Cathedral website, and that website is up on the screen right now. So we want to make sure that you get a chance to take a look at that and participate in that important event. And we talk about Parish Action, and that's an initiative that we started just about a year ago after the federal election debate from a Catholic perspective that we held at the Archdiocese of Toronto. If you're interested in participating in these kind of webinars on a variety of topics to learn how to engage with your local elected officials, take a look at the link on the screen now, and give us your contact information so we can keep you informed and share our resources with you, because we really would love for you to be involved. And again, consider the donation of your time, your talent, or your treasure with any of the organizations that have been involved in the webinar tonight. The websites are on your screen right now, the Aid to the Church in Need website, Canada website, or at the Office for Refugees. And then you can also go back and look at, if you'd like, our Catholic federal election debate from last year, where we covered some of these issues and pose the questions to the political parties. And that was an important conversation that we had with them. So before we sign off, I just want to thank, on behalf of everyone who's participating in the webinar, I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Carl Haytu, Mary-Claude Lalonde, Deacon Rudy Ovchak. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights, and more importantly, for what you continue to do. It is so important. It is our faith in action. So merci, and we are so grateful for all that you do. I want to thank you for giving your time tonight. I want to thank those who joined us on the webinar. I want to thank Mark Brosens from the Office of Public Relations and Communications, who pulled all this together on short notice. But we're so glad that you were able to be with us. Hope to see many of you on Sunday at the Mass. And let's not forget, pray for the people who are being persecuted around the world. And also, let's get engaged and get involved. So thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Neil.